Okay, everybody. We are picking up where we left off. This is getting organized, and this is part two. And just to reorient you to this, we're really looking here at big picture. I'm not going into detail on the particular tasks and all of the components in each task yet. I'm going to do that in later classes and screencasts. This is just to give you a big picture so that you understand what you need to think about before getting started, what questions you need to ask your cooperating teacher and any course instructors or clinical supervisors working with you, just to kind of get you set up on this edTPA. And again, all of this is in your handbook, but students have just said that it's easier if that's sort of digested for them and presented this way. So I want to talk about task 3 now. Task 3. This is your assessment task. And one of the questions that I always have about this is, am I writing about all of the assessments that I design in my learning segment and that I implement in every single lesson? And the answer is no. Task 3 is really about just one assessment that you're going to use. And that assessment really, I think, should be a summative assessment. In my experience, it's best if you design one formal summative assessment that you administer at the very end of your learning segment, and you use that for task 3. And the reason for that is because the more learning objectives that you've set out for your students in your learning segment, the more learning objectives that you can incorporate into your summative assessment, the more you have to write about. And that's really, I think, the most important part with task 3 is just making sure that you have everything you need so that you can write about it. So again, that first bullet point is just reminding you that you can use any assessment that you like, but I recommend the summative assessment that I just described. And that you do want to let your cooperating teacher know that at the end of the learning segment, the lesson plans that you've designed and that you plan to teach and record, there has to be a summative that you need to implement, you need to evaluate, and you need to record the results of and then write about for task 3. So let your cooperating teacher know about that because that's going to affect your planning. And then once you identify your central focus, as we talked about in the last part of, or in the first part of this, once you've identified that and the standards that connect with your central focus and the learning objectives that connect with your standards and your central focus, and the skills and the understanding, all of that goes into your summative assessment. And so, just like good old backward design, the lesson plans that you design are going to align with that summative assessment. Just some other ideas about summative assessment. Look at this example. So sketch out your idea of a summative assessment. Share this idea with your cooperating teacher. And then here's an example. This is that Spanish that I talked about in the prior screencast. The summative assessment will be a draft. So a draft is fine for a summative assessment. It doesn't have to be like, a perfect final draft. It can be a draft in which students are combining the skills and understandings, the learning objectives. They're using those learning objectives that you have set forth for them. So to draft the persuasive letter in which the students use the present perfect tense, vocabulary, and phrases related to school life, and persuasive language to persuade our school principal to make a change to school life. So that's just an example. We've looked at the learning objectives and the central focus for this Spanish example, and this would be the summative assessment. And just in reading that, hopefully you can remember that it aligns really nicely with the central focus and the learning objectives and the way that that Spanish teacher was thinking about sketching out. Chapter 5 just refers to my book on the edTPA. Chapter 5 is about task 3. And I'm just detailing sort of an overview of task 3. That final diamond point, remember that you can use a summative assessment that's already been developed. This is really important. You're not going to get extra points throughout any of the edTPA for being creative and designing your own lesson plans and your own learning segment and assessments and activities. You don't get extra points for that. And even though that's a great way to teach, and it certainly keeps you in teaching longer, the more creative you can be, for the edTPA, it is absolutely fine. And in fact, I would recommend that you use a summative assessment. Maybe it even has evaluation criteria that you can use and modify somewhat. But work that's already been developed either by your CT or some publishing company, because you really do have enough to do with the edTPA and also just the job of student teaching and going to your seminar. Um, there isn't any reason to go out and create your own work. So you can certainly ask your cooperating teacher as you're setting this up if he or she has an assessment that might work well with this learning segment that you want to design. Okay. This is just, a graphic that I developed to help you think about how everything is going to fit together in your edTPA. So if you look at it, you have your central focus kind of in the middle of that graphic. And again, that's like your thesis. That's your big idea. This is the, what is it that you want your students to learn? What is it that you want your students to be able to demonstrate? And what is it that you want your students to be able to explain or describe or analyze? Um, insert your own language function there, but the central focus kind of holds everything together. And you want to make sure that the central focus is aligned with the learning objectives. So the learning objectives come out of the central focus. They're connected to it. The learning standards over to the right are also connected to the central focus. So you're going to be looking at national standards like NCTE or NCTM, NCSS, and you're also going to be using any state standards that are required, like the New York State Common Core standards. And so you can pull from those standards, and the standards need to be aligned with your central focus and your learning objectives. So if I'm thinking about that Spanish learning segment, the standards are going to have something to do with using language to communicate, right, for an effective purpose in a valid cultural context, something about learning new vocabulary words and phrases, and probably standards connected to verb tense, a particular kind of verb tense. And those are also going to align with my learning objectives. So my standards and my learning objectives work together. They're going to mirror each other, and they're connected not only to each other, but to the central focus. And your disciplinary requirements, those are the big questions, again, that I said in each handbook are going to have those orange squares, right? And the example in math is going to be procedural fluency, conceptual understanding, and mathematical reasoning. The disciplinary requirements are going to sound a lot like your learning objectives and your learning standards, but you're just going to need to make sure that you're touching on those throughout your planning. So plan for them. And again, the disciplinary requirements need to connect to the central focus. So if I'm designing math work, I want to make sure that in my central focus, I'm writing a central focus that keeps procedural fluency, conceptual understanding, and mathematical reasoning and problem solving in mind. It connects with those disciplinary requirements so that I know my students are going to be working with those disciplinary requirements. And again, the disciplinary requirements definitely come out of the Common Core, so they're going to connect to your learning standards, and your learning standards are going to connect to your learning objectives. And it all goes back to your central focus. Now over to the left, this is what we're really looking at with task 3. This is your evaluation criteria. So this is your rubric. These are the criteria that you're using to assess whether or not students learned what you think that you taught them. And your evaluation criteria shouldn't be criteria that you're just taking out of the air, or that you think, it's a good idea to use these criteria, they need to be aligned with your central focus. And they also need to connect with your learning objectives and your learning standards and your disciplinary requirements. And one of the things that I often say is that if you take your learning objectives that you've designated for your students in task 1 and you kind of flip them and rewrite them, they become your evaluation criteria for your summative assessment. And you can actually use the same language, right? Students will be able to demonstrate that they can use a particular verb tense, or students will be able to demonstrate that they can accurately use particular vocabulary. So all of this is connected. And I just want to say, as you're thinking about evaluation criteria and you're making your plans, if you're working with literacy in any way, and you're thinking that it would be a good idea to include something like mechanics on your evaluation criteria for task 3, like spelling or punctuation, make sure that you don't just randomly stick that on your evaluation criteria at the end. Make sure that you somehow include that in your central focus. So it might be something like, students can use the appropriate conventions for, whatever the purpose of your central focus is. And your learning objectives need to take that into account. So it might be that you're going to do a little bit of a review or ask students to use their prior knowledge of conventions in whatever piece of writing they're creating, if you're going to include that in the evaluation criteria. But you don't want to include evaluation criteria that you haven't introduced, that you haven't taught, and that are not connected to your central focus and therefore your learning objectives. Now you're also going to be thinking about particular students as you're designing your lesson plans, as you're teaching your lesson plans, and as you're assessing students. I'm not going to read through all of these because you can pause this and you can read. But I'll just go through and do a quick summary, right? So again, these are questions to ask, and most likely you're going to ask your cooperating teacher. You can also ask yourself as you're doing observations and maybe assessments, but your cooperating teacher is going to provide you with a lot of this information. And later, when you're writing about your lesson plans in task 1, you're going to be asked, what evidence do you have that students have particular prior knowledge? What evidence do you have that students have particular interests, personal or cultural interests? A lot of that is going to go back to your cooperating teacher, especially if you haven't been in the school very long. So the first one is about, what special curriculum is at play in your classroom that you may have to follow? Is there a textbook? Is there some kind of, test prep pacing? Is it a particular season? Is it spring? And so as a result, you're working on the fitnessgram or you're working in the sport of volleyball. What's the special curriculum that you need to follow? Maybe there's nothing and you just get to develop whatever you want around maybe a theme or a set of skills and understandings. You could note that too. Again, asking your cooperating teacher, this second one is, to say, I want to teach this unit on whatever date, 6th week or 7th week of student teaching. What topic are we going to be working on then? You need to have buy-in and cooperation from your cooperating teacher so that, you aren't just deciding what you're going to teach 3 days before you teach and record. The third one is about pace. Again, I talked about that as a test prep. Are there topics that you must touch on certain days? Is there an order? This last one is important. How are students grouped? Is there an expectation? And why? Why are students grouped in particular ways? You definitely want to honor the groupings, and you want to be able to design lesson plans to accommodate the groupings and the reasons that students are grouped. You want to be able to teach when you're working with them in your video, particular groups to show that you can meet a number of different needs. And you're certainly going to be assessing. You may have to make some modifications or accommodations for those groups. More questions to ask. The prior knowledge question is one that you will have to deal with in task 1. So you want to ask your cooperating teacher, what prior knowledge do they have about the topic that I want to teach? And prior knowledge in terms of skills and understandings. Maybe it relates to a standard that they worked with in the previous grade. Maybe it's a topic that they've been working on all year, or a skill set. What can you point to as evidence that students have some prior knowledge that relates to the topic that you want to teach? And when you start thinking about the topic you want to teach, you want to ask the cooperating teacher again, what are some confusions or misunderstandings that you anticipate they'll have? Your cooperating teacher is going to know this because your cooperating teacher has probably already taught this topic in the past. And once you go through and you teach it and you assess the students and you have some experience with it, you're going to know where they're going to make mistakes or have confusions, but you might not know that going into this. So it's really helpful to ask that question about your topic. Again, number 3, what mistakes are they going to make? And then, thinking again with your cooperating teacher, what are some supports you would put into place to help clear up misunderstandings or mistakes your students might make before you actually start teaching the unit. That way you can, put some supports in place so that you can ensure your students are learning and, just be more efficient in that way. Same set of questions that you're going to be asking your cooperating teacher and maybe observing for. Are there students in your class who have special learning needs? And again, special learning needs can be a broad category. Are there students who have an IEP or 504? If your cooperating teacher doesn't share that information with you, remember you can just ask for, what are some accommodations that I need to make sure I make when I'm teaching and designing for this group of students. Do I have gifted and talented? That's a classification. If students aren't classified as gifted and talented, do I have students who are advanced in some way? And even in PE, do I have advanced athletes in the class? And these are all special learning needs that you're going to want to know so that you can start planning for. Other learning needs would be English language learners. You really need to know if you have English language learners and what level they're at. Do I have newcomers? How many absolute beginners? Or do I have more advanced English language learners? Because then you may have to employ, some PSYOP or some strategies to support the English language learners in your class. And remember that English language learners don't necessarily have to be students who speak a different language at home. They could also speak a dialect or a language other than what you're going to see in textbook English. Okay. I'm sticking with the same topic. Now we're thinking about learning styles, so you want to be asking your cooperating teacher and also observing in your early weeks because you want to plan for students who are visual or auditory or kinesthetic, right? If you've got visual students, English language learners often are visual learners at first. Are you going to use visuals in order to help teach your lesson? If you have kinesthetic students, are you going to give them opportunities to get up and move around so that they're not just sort of, sitting and learning that way if they learn better when they move? What kinds of intelligences? So now we're thinking about Howard Gardner, right? Do you have students who are logical, linguistic, artistic? You probably have all of these. So you want to try to plan as broadly as you can for these would be individuals in your class who have individual needs. The next bullet point there is really about introverts, right? And a lot of what we do in school is designed for social learning, and that's wonderful. But you may have a student or two in your class who they need to have some time and space in the classroom away from everybody in order to process their learning. And so how are you going to work in opportunities to give them a little bit of peace and quiet so that they can process and do their best learning? So this is kind of about learning styles that you might have in your class. And this advice piece is, there's this idea out there in edTPA land that if you are student teaching in a classroom where there are English language learners or students with classifications like IEPs, the student teacher doesn't want to include them when they are representing who's in their class in their edTPA portfolio, because if you state that you have students with special learning needs up front, but then you don't plan for them in task 1 and you don't accommodate them in your assessment in task 3, you can fail a couple of the rubrics. And that is true. However, if you play it too safe and you just use focus students who are very similar and you don't really differentiate, you're not showing that you can teach to a variety of students. And you want to be able to do that in the edTPA also, because you're going to score higher on those rubrics. Your 4s and your 5s are really about being able to accommodate groups of students or individuals with special learning needs. So my recommendation is that you do include that range of students in your classroom. You say that they're all in there, and you actually plan, you take the time to plan for them and assess them. And you know what? That's really good practice for you anyhow, because that's real life. Okay. So for getting organized, this is a checklist, and again, I'll go through it very quickly, but you can pause it, do whatever you need to use this checklist. But it's kind of a review of everything that I've talked about in these 2 screencasts, getting organized. So one is, set up your edTPA, set it up with 3 folders, do that right away so that your stuff isn't all over the place. You really want to be organized here because there's so much. You're going to end up writing about 75 or 80 pages. Ask your course instructor, your clinical professor, that would be me, how you get your handbook, where's your handbook, where are your templates? How do you get all of that? Are you using a platform like TK20? We're not using that, but some colleges do. So how do you get the stuff that you're going to need, especially that handbook? Read through the descriptions of your tasks so that you get I presented that to you here, a general overview of what you're collecting. Definitely schedule a meeting, or maybe 2 or 3, with your cooperating teacher to discuss the topics that I asked you to focus on. Have a conversation with your cooperating teacher about the learning needs, the prior knowledge. Get your video permission form to your students. Do that in your 1st or 2nd week. Then start to draft out your central focus for your unit and make sure that it meets the requirements. Again, think of it as a thesis. Check with your cooperating teacher to make sure that that central focus sounds realistic and achievable. Then identify your learning objectives and your standards and your disciplinary requirements. And again, they're all going to be kind of similar, but you're going to be needing to address all of them, the specific objectives you lay out for your students, the standards that your objectives relate to, and the disciplinary requirements that you're going to be planning for and looking for in assessments and teaching, supporting your students to accomplish in task 2 in your video, so that they've got to be worked into your lesson plans. Check with your cooperating teacher again, just to make sure your learning objectives are on target, that they're not unrealistic or too easy. Your objectives shouldn't be entirely skill-based, because you won't score high on rubrics if they are. You want to have some challenge in there, and you want to have some work with concepts and understandings. Draft out your summative assessment, and again, make sure that your summative assessment encompasses all of the learning objectives that you have set forth in task 1 when you're planning, and you want to make sure that the evaluation criteria that you use to score your summative assessment is aligned with the learning objectives that you state you hope your students will accomplish as they work with your central focus. And check with your cooperating teacher again to make sure your summative assessment and your evaluation criteria are realistic, they're achievable, and they're not too easy. Okay, so it's not just skills. Start drafting out as soon as you can your lesson plans, knowing that sometimes this will change a little bit as things change, but you want to start drafting out how it is you're going to accomplish your central focus and how you might break it down into 3 days, like I showed you in the very first screencast, Getting Organized Part 1. Check with your cooperating teacher to make sure that your lesson plan ideas are realistic. Again, does that make sense to have, if I'm teaching elementary and I'm teaching maybe third grade, does it make sense to one day work on sequencing and the next day work on temporal words and maybe the next day work on important details? Do you think that that's a good way to break down my central focus into 3 discrete lessons? And your cooperating teacher will let you know. It might be too fast, it might be too slow, but that's going to depend on your students and how quickly they work and the prior knowledge that they already have. Decide for task 2 the device you're going to use to record your lessons. This is, I think, really good advice because I've seen disasters before. Test your device to make sure that you've got enough memory to record 45 minutes. And my recommendation would be that when it is time for you to record, you record 45 minutes and then you upload it, you take it off your camera or whatever your recording device is, clearing memory. But before you even do your very first lesson, just make sure that your recording device can hold 45 minutes so that it doesn't cut off in 20 minutes.